Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. It's me, Rachel, the student witch. I hope you're doing well. 2020 is almost over. Well, welcome back to the series. This is a little mini-series, if you're following this series, on my channel of Sagittarius season. I have 4 planets in Sagittarius, including my sun, and since Sagittarius is towards the end of the year, we're in Sagittarius season right now, and I figured that a lot of the work that I've been doing in 2020 is liberating my sense of self from the lingering effects of childhood trauma, emotional neglect, and verbal and psychological abuse. And so that's why I've started this kind of series, and I wanted to share some of the resources that have really helped me kind of get a grip and really begin a new phase of my journey in working through these things. So before I get into today's review for today's book, I just want to give some important considerations or caveats. One, I'm not a mental health professional at all in any way, shape, or form. And I've just been on the receiving end of that. And 2, specifically when I wanted to, and when I was starting to put this kind of mini-series together, I had a specific audience in mind, and that is people toward the beginning of their journey of unpacking and healing and recovering from childhood experiences of abuse and neglect and trauma. And even more specific than that, people who don't at the moment have access to professional mental health care, or people who are looking for kind of supplementary materials to help and aid and maybe guide their work with their therapist or their mental health professional or counselor or whoever they're working with, right? So that's who I had in mind for this series. Another important caveat, now that I think of it, that I should mention is that these books, the 4 books that I'm talking about specifically, and I'll have the reviews linked up here in the cards as I make them, but I'll also have the titles and authors of the books down in the description box. But these books are not a replacement for professional therapy and mental health care. Nothing really is. Or, working with some sort of professional or counselor, life coach, that kind of dynamic is really irreplaceable. But, like I said, not everybody has access to that. And so I'm keeping those people in mind, and even if you don't at the moment have the money for or have access to therapy or working with a psychologist or whatever, these books can still provide you a good place to start and can kind of help you get the ball rolling, right? Okay, caveats over, let's get into the video. So today, and I have my notes here, we're talking about Healing Your Emotional Self, a powerful program to help you raise your self-esteem, quiet your inner critic, and overcome your shame by Beverly Engel. And I read this book earlier this year, probably about 4 to 5 months ago at this point. This was the second book that I've read. The first book I'll have linked up here. I did a video about that a few days ago, about less than a week ago, about children of emotionally immature parents. And now the Children of Emotionally Immature Parents book is more specifically about the effects of emotional neglect on the psychological and emotional development of children. Today's book, Healing Your Emotional Self, is also about that, but it is more specifically about neglect and verbal abuse. She does mention other forms of abuse, like more physical and sexual forms of abuse, but she doesn't get too much into that. This is more about emotional neglect and emotional and verbal abuse. So that's why these two books are a little bit different. And I found this book, Healing Your Emotional Self, to be a great kind of next step. I'm really glad I read the Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents book first, because that kind of helped me to see the role my father played, because my mother was the more overtly abusive one. My father was just complicit in that. It helped me to understand his emotional immaturity. It helped me to understand why I am the way I am, like some of the basics about, where my social anxiety comes from and my lack of confidence and my self-esteem issues. It helped kind of lay the groundwork. But Beverly Engel's book, Healing Your Emotional Self, took that to another level. It's because she talks more overtly and explicitly about abuse, what abuse is, and specifically emotional and verbal abuse, and the effects that abuse can have on your sense of self, your self-esteem, your confidence or lack thereof in yourself, your adult relationships, and your own issues regulating your own emotions and your own developmental arrests. So I found this book really helpful right off the bat. I can recommend it for 3 reasons. Reason number 1, how clearly it was written. It's not too long. It's just over 200 pages. It's, like I said, it's very clearly written. She does a really good job of listing information and providing clear definitions of very important concepts, which I'll go over here in a minute. And she also, right off the bat, tells you how to work with the book, because, and this leads me to the second reason why I love this book so much, there are a lot of exercises and assignments. She calls them mirror assignments, and I'll give a couple examples later on in the review. But there are assignments in each chapter, and she recommends that you work through the book week by week. So read and work through 1 chapter per week, or something around that pace, and which I did. That gives you enough time to digest the information, to do the emotional processing, to work through the assignments in each chapter. I found that really, really helpful, and so the amount of assignments would be reason number 2 why I liked this book so much. And reason number 3 is a little bit more personal. It's just the number of aha, eureka, light bulb going off moments that I had. Throughout 2020 and the work that I've been doing on myself, the great unfucking, as I call it, has really been about getting to the root, the why, the how, and the where it comes from, the root of my self-esteem issues and my inner critic issues, which for the longest time, since before 2020, I've just been kind of halfway jokingly referring to it as my inner demon, my demon, right? And I vaguely understood where it came from. I knew it had something to do with what my mom and my dad put us through growing up. I knew the roots of it were planted, the seeds of it were planted there, but I didn't understand specifically how it worked or what to call it besides my demon. Now I understand it's the toxic inner critic, and I think all 4 of the books that I'm talking about throughout Sagittarius season mention the toxic critic, like a toxic internalized critic being a characteristic, a very common characteristic for people who have gone through emotional neglect and abuse in childhood at the hands of their primary caregivers. And so I finally have a name for the demon. It's the toxic inner critic. I finally understand in more detail where my self-esteem issues come from and why I have self-esteem issues and where my self-loathing comes from. I finally understand to, at a deeper level, why I always felt kind of empty, why I had trouble feeling confident in my decision-making skills, why I was always telling myself that nothing I did was ever good enough, where my perfectionism comes from. I understand these things so much better now thanks to this book. So those are the 3 reasons why, right off the bat, I would definitely recommend this book. Now, before I kind of break down some of the concepts that she talks about, I do have one kind of itty-bitty critique of the book, and that is just how kind of gender normative and binary and heteronormative it is. I wouldn't say that that is a major roadblock to, getting something out of the book. It's not really that, it's not a huge thing in the book. It just kind of pops up when she talks about reparenting yourself, which is another common thread between all the books I'm going to talk about this Sagittarius season. They all kind of talk about the process of inner child work and reparenting yourself. But she, when she talks about remothering or refathering, it's just the wording, the word choice is just a little kind of old-fashioned and gender binary-ish, because at the end of the day, and I think she does clarify this a little bit, remothering yourself is just re-nurturing yourself, and refathering yourself is just building up an inner protector. I think she calls it the inner nurturer and the inner protector. But it's just kind of a wording thing. It's not that big of a deal, but it's just something I noticed. So be aware of that, I guess. Okay, as far as the content of the book goes, I'll share a little bit, and I have my notes here, my condensed notes, because I took more extensive notes in this notebook, and then I condensed them down in this notebook. Some of the important ideas and concepts that she defines within the first couple chapters, maybe even in the first chapter, include self-esteem, like what exactly is self-esteem, self-concept, emotional abuse, emotional neglect, psychological maltreatment, sense of self, body image, individuation, enmeshment, and the toxic inner critic. And then as you work through the book, she goes on to define other concepts like perfectionism, that kind of thing. And I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about emotional abuse, neglect, and psychological maltreatment, because these are very important concepts for this book. And emotional abuse, and this is kind of paraphrasing what she said, is a pattern of behavior that occurs on a continuous basis over time that attacks a child's emotional development and sense of self-worth. And that's really important when defining like exactly what is abuse. It has to be a pattern of behavior that is consistent over time, right? It's not like, mom had a stressful day and she snapped at her kids every once in a while. Like, this is a clear, definable pattern, consistent pattern of behavior that attacks a child's emotional development and sense of self-worth. Emotional neglect is the failure to provide the nurturing and positive support necessary for a child's emotional and psychological growth and development. And then psychological maltreatment is the deliberate, conscious infliction of harm, a pattern of psychically destructive behavior, including rejecting, isolating, and terrorizing. And so, emotional neglect, my first thought is my father, and I talk a little bit more about that when I talk about, in the last video I did about emotionally immature parents. Emotional abuse and psychological maltreatment are definitely something that my mother did to us. She used toxic shame, she used toxic guilt, she mocked us, she would threaten to, she threatened to publicly humiliate me in order to coerce me to do what she wanted me to do. She terrorized me, she controlled every aspect of my life, basically, and I'll get more into this when I talk about the Daughters of Narcissistic Mothers book, which is the next review that's coming later this week, probably. So those are really important concepts that she defines right off the bat. Now, the concept of the mirror. This has to do with empathetic mirroring, right? And Beverly Engel, she developed a program based on this idea of the mirror, and this book is kind of like an intro to this program that she developed. If you hear somebody talking in the background, that's my partner. He's in a meeting right now. Sorry about that. But she talks about the 7 types of negative parental mirrors, and basically what she means by this is when your parent is emotionally neglecting or abusing you, instead of having an appropriate empathetic response to the child's emotional needs, they neglect or abuse, and the specific form of the neglect or the abuse basically sends a message to the child. It's like the parent holds a mirror up to the child, right? Because the child is constructing its sense of self and its idea of what the world is, right? And so in neglecting and abusing the child, the parent is holding a mirror up to the child and telling the child or shaping how the child understands itself, right? Its very sense of self, its value in the world, what it can expect from relationships, all sorts of things. So the first type of negative parental mirror is the neglectful or inadequate parent, and the mirror that they hold up to you, the child, is you are unlovable. Right? The parent is so self-involved or neglectful, dumping the kid on everybody else, not taking responsibility, not putting in quality time with the kid. And so what does the kid begin to understand about itself? I'm unlovable. Right? Mirror number 2 is the abandoning or rejecting parent, and the mirror that they hold up to the kid is you're worthless. Number 3, the smothering, possessive, or intrusive parent. The mirror that they hold up is, you're nothing without me. And that's that, I'm swallowing you into my own sense of self kind of behavior that's common with narcissistic parents. Mirror number 4, the overly controlling and tyrannical parent, and this is my mom, you are powerless mirror. And that's definitely something I can resonate with. When I went off to college, I had some scholarship money and grants money to cover my tuition, and so I was on the golf team, but the university I went to did not give athletic scholarship. It only gave academic and need-based scholarship and aid. And so my parents wanted me, especially my mom, and my dad too, to be on the golf team because I was on the golf team, among other things, in high school. And I remember I hated it. I wanted to quit. I injured my wrist in the middle of the season, which was painful. And I figured, it's not like my scholarship money depends on me being on this team, so why don't I just quit? And I remember I had one of my first, maybe not one of my first, but I had a psychological break. I was crying and hysterical. I felt scared. I felt so scared. And at the time, I even remember thinking to myself, what is wrong with you? Why are you scared to tell the coach that you're quitting and tell your parents that you quit the team? Why? Where is this coming from? And now I understand it's because of my tyrannical narcissistic mother. she instilled in me the belief about myself that I am powerless. And so making a decision about myself, something as maybe simple as deciding to quit the team because there's no consequence to quitting the team, and I would rather like spend my time having fun with my friends but also doing like my homework. You know, it was just, it was really impressive at the time, and now I have a better understanding of why that happened. You know, this is back when I was like 17, 18, something like that. It's because I believed that I was powerless. Anyway, number 5, the perfectionistic parent, which is also my mother. The mirror that they hold up to you is, you are never good enough, which, oh Lord, is that my mother? Like verbatim telling me that nothing I do is ever good enough. Number 6, the hypercritical or shaming parent, which is also my mother. The mirror that they hold up to you is, you are bad or you are unacceptable, which is something I really internalized. My sense of self, I just didn't think that I was lovable or acceptable. I felt powerless. I felt like nothing I did was ever good enough. I internalized that perfectionism because she projected her own perfectionism onto me. And mirror number 7, the self-absorbed or narcissistic parent, which is also my mother. You don't matter. Basically, even though my mother from the outside looked like she was super involved in my life, really she was just living through me and turning and overpowering and stopping my own development of a sense of self, because what mattered was her sense of self getting what it wanted from everybody. And so in that sense, she taught me that I don't matter. My wants, my needs don't matter. What matters is her getting what she wanted, right? And being tyrannical and perfectionistic about it. So those are the 7 types of negative parental mirrors that she goes through. When she talks about perfectionism, something that stuck out to me that I wrote down was that perfectionism is a way of compensating for an underlying sense of defectiveness. And that underlying sense of defectiveness comes from these negative mirrors that the abusive parent holds up to you and teaches you about yourself. This is how the abusive parent molds and shapes and affects the development of your sense of self and the core beliefs about yourself. That you're powerless, that you're never good enough, that you're unacceptable, that you're unlovable, that you're worthless, that you don't matter, right? That's how this kind of abuse works, and that's why it's so damaging, right? So she talks about some strategies about how to face and reject your parents' negative mirrors. She talks about this process of, building up your own mirrors, which is basically building up a new sense of self. She very explicitly, and this is something that almost knocked me upside the head, she says, your task is basically to redefine and rebuild yourself, is to build a new sense of self, a new self for yourself, which is a monumental task, and it's scary and can be overwhelming, and it's a big deal, and it's hard, but it's so rewarding. I'm still kind of toward the beginning of my journey with this, but good Lord, is it liberating and is it rewarding, but also it is scary, because your life as you've known it up until this point has been shaped by this abuse. Your very sense of self, your understanding of yourself, your core beliefs about yourself, all of it was shaped by your most formative and vulnerable years at the hands of these inept and abusive parents or primary caregivers, right? And now you are given the task of reinventing yourself from that, and it's a big deal. So anybody out there on that journey, I'm so proud of you. It's a big deal. You got this. Anyway, She talks about facing the truth and releasing pent-up emotions, and this includes anger, repressed anger, and acceptance, and releasing and grieving, like crying it out, really. She talks about placing responsibility where it belongs. Give back your parents' projections. So my mom used to use guilt and shame a lot on us. And so now, instead of internalizing that toxic shame, I give it back to her. I give the guilt back to her. I give the disgust and the contempt back to her. I place responsibility back where it belongs, and that's on her. I was a helpless child. I was completely vulnerable to her. My father wasn't willing to defend us or intervene, so we were just completely, the whole dysfunctional family dynamic revolved around her because she, being the narcissist that she is, everything had to revolve around her, and everything had to do with her getting what she wanted from everybody all the time. So, I give that shit back to her, for real. Turn shame into righteous anger. The importance of anger. And I think it's in this book where Beverly Engel talks about how anger is actually an important step in your individuation process of liberating yourself from this, because it's a sign that your sense of identity and sense of self is becoming more and more separated from and divorced from your parents, which is a good thing. It's a necessary thing if you've been through this kind of crap, especially. She talks about identify and counter negative core beliefs. And some of the negative core beliefs that she included, I wrote down here. When things are going well, something bad will happen. This is a big one for me. Anytime there's kind of a calm moment, when I'm having a good day, when things seem to be going well, when we receive good news, like just the other day, for months and months, we didn't think that we got any of the stimulus money, the emergency stimulus relief money from earlier this year from the United States. And then we were checking a bank account that we left open in the US, and turns out we did. And so boom, there's like $2,400 that we didn't think that we had. That's good news. But immediately after receiving that good news, my mind started catastrophizing and thinking about things that can go wrong. That is a negative core belief that results from abuse. Relationships are dangerous is another big one. Life is a constant struggle. That's a huge one for me. And labeling these sorts of things beliefs instead of just accepting them to be true is a big step, because beliefs can be changed, right? These are not descriptive statements of universal truths or anything like that. These are just beliefs, and you can change your beliefs, right? You don't deserve recognition or success is another one. You don't deserve comfort or stability is another big one for me. Nothing good will last. You have no control over life or what happens to you. That's another one. Your only value is what you can do for others. That's a big one, especially when you have kind of controlling narcissistic parent like I did. Your value depends on them being pleased with your performance, basically. And they also tell you that your performance is never good enough, and so therefore your value is never good enough. You are not, your value as a human being is not ever good enough. And so they kind of condition you to think that your value as a human being is based on you pleasing others, and that sets you up for like kind of dependent, codependent dynamics later in life. You can't be assertive because others will abandon you is another big one that I've been like really opened my eyes to this year. I'm so afraid to disagree with other people, to be assertive, to define boundaries and put limits on people, because I was conditioned to be afraid of abandonment and rejection. And you can't trust your perceptions. That's a big one too. So those are some of those, just a few of the negative core beliefs that she talks about. She does have, I believe, an entire chapter about the pathological inner critic, or the inner saboteur, and how it works and what you can do about it, and why it's such a like a defining characteristic of the effects of emotional neglect and abuse. She talks about the process of creating a new mirror for yourself, which is that process of individuation, of rebuilding your sense of self, basically. The importance of reparenting yourself, which I mentioned earlier, your internal nurturer and your internal protector, inner child work. And she has a few specific chapters toward the end of the book about defining characteristics of a few of the most damaging types of abusive parents, including the narcissistic parent and the tyrannical parent and the abandoning or neglectful parent. So she does have some chapters where she goes more into depth about some of the types of negative parental mirrors or negative parental abuse. The chapter about the narcissistic parent really opened my eyes and helped. It provided a nice segue into the next book that I'm going to talk about narcissistic mothers and their daughters. Now, really quickly, the mirror therapy assignments. She has somewhere in the book, I can't remember which chapter, but she has a list of psychological truths. You can probably hear my neighbors and their daughter in the hallway right now. And it's a list of, I think it's 13 psychological truths. And she, throughout the book, matches one or two psychological truths to the assignments in each chapter that you can do to work through and really digest the material of each chapter. So, for example, mirror therapy assignment number 6 is matched with one psychological truth, and that is those who have a history of abuse or neglect tend to remain enmeshed with their parents out of a desperate desire to get what they did not get when they were children. And then the assignment, the mirror therapy assignment, builds on that psychological truth and helps you kind of pull it apart and understand it and journal about it. So I found those really helpful. So yeah, I definitely recommend this book. It's our neighbor's daughter. I definitely recommend this book. It was definitely a level up kind of book. It leveled up my understanding of myself and my issues and where they come from, and helped me to begin this journey of unfucking myself. And it provided a nice stepping stone to the book about narcissistic mothers and complex PTSD, which I'll talk about later this week. So if you've read this book, please let me know what your thoughts are down below. If you want to share any resources related to this topic, please share them in the comments down below. And until next time, many blessings. Bye.